Hello and welcome to episode 242 of the Ideal Nutrition Podcast. My name is Aidan Muir and I'm here with my co-host Torwen Eerkens, and this is an episode where we're going to be talking about whether whole food diets lead to greater fat loss. And for me, this was partly prompted by the fact that I saw a post on Instagram where they mathematically went through and broke down what I would call the net calorie difference of two diets that are technically the same amount of calories, but would have a difference in the total theoretical size of the deficit at the end of the day. And this is a concept obviously very familiar with and everything like that, but I've never seen anyone just chuck some numbers on it. I was like, that's actually a cool idea. I want to talk about that. So for this one, we're going to do a bit of both talking about the direct and also the indirect potential differences based on whole food diets and less whole food diets, just in general.
So let's chat about what we consider a whole food diet. A whole food diet emphasises mostly foods that are minimally processed, close to their natural form. So we're talking things like lots of vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, nuts, seeds, lean protein sources, and maybe dairy or alternatives with minimal additives.
From a macronutrient perspective, in many cases, they're going to be higher in protein and also higher in fiber as well. But then you can also make a little bit of an argument that if they're closer to the natural state, they can often be more difficult to digest. And you could view that as sometimes that sounds like a bad thing, but in terms of fat loss, it might actually be a beneficial thing because you could theoretically be absorbing less of the calories and you could feel fuller for longer. And there's a lot of things in there too.
So how could this lead to more fat loss? Should we chat about the indirect effects first?
I reckon we'll start with, let's start with just broad, calories in, calories out. I know it's very simple, but I think we'll go through that very quickly. So obviously we know that every day we eat a certain amount of calories, every day we burn a certain amount of calories. If the amount of calories we are consuming is less than what we're burning, typically that will lead to fat loss. Why that is the case is because calories are simply a unit of energy. We get them externally from food and drink. We have internal stores in our body. And because it's simply a unit of energy, it cannot just disappear and it cannot just come out of nowhere. So theoretically, if we have physically utilized more calories than we have taken in from food and drink, it has to come from somewhere. So it comes from our internal stores of muscle, fat, or glycogen. Ideally, we're holding on to all of our muscle. So therefore, it's coming from body fat most likely, and that is our fuel source of energy, or it is a fuel source of energy. Body fat has around 7,700 calories. As I've said, the body's partly made up of calories. So for this to have either an indirect effect or a direct effect on fat loss, it has to play a role somewhere within the confines of that kind of understanding.
Absolutely. So you need to be in a calorie deficit to lose body fat. Indirectly then, you've touched on a few of these already, but by having a whole foods diet, likely you're increasing satiety, having more fiber, having more protein. Protein we know contributes most to satiety. Fiber helps increase fullness, increase the size of the meal without necessarily increasing calories massively. This can help with reducing passive overeating. Likely, it also means that you're not eating as much if you're more satiated.
I also think people will have less desire to eat as well. The food industry is very good at making food taste nice, and sometimes in the more natural form, it's just less appealing to eat. There's less options as well because you're quite literally excluding or very limited, having a very limited intake of a lot of the options that we have available. It obviously reduces convenience because they're let's say you're having a piece of whole fruit that is less convenient than it is to have something that's already pre-done, so on and so forth. Many people just end up in a deficit due to that. And that is obviously just theoretical, common sense, so on and so forth. But there is a little bit of research directly looking at this. So the most classic example of this is there was a study by Kevin Hall where they looked at processed versus unprocessed food. And it was just an ad libitum study where they just got the food provided for them and they measured how much they ate. The people in the processed food group obviously ate more than the people in the unprocessed food. If you really wanted to criticize, you could be what if they just got given nicer food? And fair enough, go down that route if you want. But I just think it's pretty clear that if you just ate to a comfortable level of fullness, in most cases, you're not going to eat as many calories as if you're following a mostly minimally processed diet.
And this was without deliberate calorie restriction. So they were told that they could eat as much as they would like. The meals were just provided for them. And it showed that those whole food diets reduce that spontaneous energy intake for all the reasons probably that we mentioned previously.
Now, let's talk direct stuff. So this is where I think it gets even more interesting because the other stuff, as I said, is pretty common sense. But like this one, if all calories are stable, does it still outperform? And the answer is yes, but we'll talk through why. So one example that I point to a fair bit is from a calorie absorption perspective. So the classic example I point to is that when we eat nuts, specifically almonds, we tend to absorb about 70 to 80% of the calories. And there is individual variation between that, but that is kind of the average there. So theoretically, if you have 30 grams of these and it says 160 calories, you might be absorbing like, I don't know, 120 or something instead. So that is a factor, because theoretically you could have the same total calories and be absorbing less from one thing than from another. It does apply to other foods. I use almonds as the example, but this applies to a lot of other foods in the whole food category. The other one that I really want to talk about is that high fiber diets have been shown to reduce calorie absorption on average by more than 100 calories per day. I was contemplating whether I go deep down the rabbit hole of like why this is, because I'm like, is it worth going down it? But I do think this is interesting. So if you're interested, here it is. If you're not, you're still going to get it anyway. So it's because like if it's soluble fiber, it has like a bit of a gel-like effect, which could be a bit of a barrier to digestion in the intestine. So then some food would go through undigested. There's a bit of bile acid reduction, which would reduce the fat absorption. And then if it's insoluble fiber, it increases transit speed, which reduces the contact time with the intestine for digestion. And that's how there's a slight reduction in calorie absorption.
Another one that might fit in this direct effect, if all calories are stable, is if we consider the thermic effect of food and that total daily energy expenditure also contributing to fat loss. So generally foods that are higher in fiber and protein have a higher thermic effect of food. This could just increase your daily energy expenditure, which means you're still in a deficit, sort of that indirectly.
Yeah, and the standard numbers we've got is like fat, it's about 0 to 3% in terms of the increase in energy expenditure associated with the fat calories. For carbs, on average, it's about 5 to 10%. I do think that one would scale more based on the type of carbs as well. And then for protein, it's about 20 to 40%. So protein is clearly the highest thermic effect of food one. We are now going to do that kind of practical example of, let's say there's two 2,000 calorie diets and they have these different features, and we can see what type of differences we'd be looking at. So let's say you've got a high protein, low fat diet. Specific macros, nearly 200 grams of protein, around 180 grams of carbs, and around 55 grams of fat. If we then measured the thermic effect of food, we'd be looking at about 300 calories as an increase in energy expenditure from that. Let's say you do the opposite. Low protein, high fat. So let's say 75 grams of protein. I kind of like hate reading a number that low, but it just is what it is. There's people doing that. 200 grams of carbs and 100 grams of fat. So quite high fat, low protein. That equals an average of a 150 calorie increase in energy expenditure from the thermic effect of food. So it's about half, but it's already a 150 calorie difference. You could use numbers that are different. You could go in between that, whatever. But the point I'm making is that if you went noticeably different, you would see a difference here. So net difference so far, 150 calories. Then let's say we do high fiber versus low fiber. That adds a 100 calorie difference roughly. So now the net difference is 250. You could go further with this example and do like super like minimally processed versus super processed or whatever. And it would be even more. But the point I'm making is even just for a 2,000 calorie diet, the difference could be 250 calories. If you went more, if you did a 3,000 calorie diet, the same thing would scale even more. Is this huge? Not really. You then stack on the indirect benefits though, and it can make a bit of a difference overall.
And even if you say 250 calories, if that's consistently every single day, again, if we go back to 1 kilo of body fat is 7,700 calories, we're looking at about an extra quarter of a kilo weight loss per week. That could be pretty significant over the long term, along with maybe just the added chronic health benefits that are moving forward. Should we talk about our advice then, or practical takeaway, and what we might recommend?
Absolutely. I think that there's so many like easy steps that can be taken in this direction. I put up a post on Instagram today about how the 80% of the population doesn't meet just like standard fiber recommendations. There are so many easy wins. They're like more fruits, more vegetables, so on and so forth. And there's so many things. But even in the fitness community as well, where most people would have what I would consider to be like relatively good diets, there's still cases where people will get swung away from this direction, particularly if there is a lot of focus on macros or tracking or whatever. Like there are many people who will, as an example, avoid fruit because they don't want to use the carbs on fruit. They would rather save that for dessert later. And then suddenly that's like just a move towards the slightly more processed food diet kind of thing, and a move away from this a little bit. And then also reduces their micronutrient intake. Then more like protein bars, protein powder. Like I'm not opposed to those things or anything like that, but you can see logic how suddenly somebody could have a good diet from a macro perspective, but are missing out on heaps of whole foods in the process as well.
And I think that's where balance comes into play. And I don't know what I think we've got pretty similar ideas on this, but if you generally aim for a diet that is, let's say, 80% whole foods and 20% more processed foods, you're still getting a lot of the benefits of having whole foods, including all of those things like hunger management, fiber, like quality protein, like healthy sources of fats, that sort of thing. But it does exist on a bit of a spectrum. So potentially it's not 100% whole foods, but there is majority whole foods.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if you do this, but like a lot of clients, if they come to me and they're already tracking macros, I actually get a lot of people to do like a 2-week break from tracking macros, where I'll do like a bit of a plan structure that is mostly based on whole foods. So like kind of force a bunch of habits that I want them to do. And it's not because I'm opposed to tracking, because actually I like tracking in a lot of situations, obviously case by case. Like I'm not going to use it in disordered eating situations. But my kind of logic is, if we went 2 weeks without tracking, it's so easy. It's so easy for us to come back to tracking. What I often find is, if I didn't go away from tracking, a lot of what I would consider to be like not ideal habits tend to stay around, because it's just like, I don't know if it's a safety net of tracking or whatever, but they just keep doing what they're doing, except with the new macros I give them.
I was going to say, if it's adding up to the macros and they think they're doing the right thing, you're kind of wanting to get rid of some of those habits maybe.
Yeah. Whereas if I say, like, let's just do the plan for like 2 weeks, like some things will stick, some things won't. We focus on what's worked well. We might play around with things that haven't, and then we can add tracking in later if we want as well.
That makes a lot of sense. Also, just adding on that, obviously we're talking about whole food diets for a lot of fat loss. If you're an athlete and you have super high energy requirements, it's almost essential to have maybe a higher aspect of processed foods in the diet, so that you're not eating a mass amount of volume each day, every day. Amazing. Well, this has been episode 242 of the Ideal Nutrition Podcast. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. And as always, if you did, we would love it if you could please leave a positive review. We'll be back next week.